My name is Ahmed Amer, or Ahmed Amer. I'm with the Computer Science and Engineering Department at the School of Engineering here at Santa Clara University, and it is an immense honor to introduce our panelists in this Greening AI panel. First, I'd like to introduce Dr. Konstantin Klemmer. He is a researcher in geospatial machine learning and a core team member at ClimateChangeAI, a nonprofit organization composed of volunteers from academia and industry who believe that tackling climate change requires concerted societal action, in which machine learning can play an impactful role. He has a PhD from the University of Warwick and has spent time as a researcher at NYU and most recently Microsoft Research. Dr. Emma Strubell, our wonderful starting speaker today, is the Raj Reddy Assistant Professor in the Language Technologies Institute at Carnegie Mellon School of Computer Science, and a visiting scientist at the Allen Institute for Artificial Intelligence. Their work has been recognized with multiple awards and cited in news outlets including the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and Nature. Strubell has co-authored multiple papers on evaluating the energy demands of various uses and types of AI, and is part of the ongoing effort called the AI Energy Score project, comparable to the well-known Energy Star ratings, which aims to prompt developers and users of AI models toward more transparency and consideration of energy consumption. And last but not least is Dr. Benjamin C. Lee. He's a professor of electrical and systems engineering and of computer and information science at the University of Pennsylvania. He is also a visiting researcher at Google in the Global Infrastructure Group. Dr. Lee's research focuses on computer architecture, energy efficiency, environmental sustainability, and security. His research on environmentally sustainable computing in collaboration with Harvard received an Expedition in Computing Award from the National Science Foundation in 2024. Dr. Lee received the NSF Computing Innovation Fellowship, the NSF Career Award, and Google Faculty Research Award. He's both an IEEE Fellow and an ACM Distinguished Scientist. Without further ado, Dr. Lee.
Thank you so much for the introduction. Thanks so much for the invitation to speak. I just wanted to set the stage, I think, speak for maybe 10, 15 minutes and then go straight into the panel, provide some context into some of the questions we're addressing today. So I just wanted to set the stage. Some of this data was presented earlier, and some of this you may have already seen, but to get everyone on the same page, growth in artificial intelligence is daunting and has grown exponentially. This is a figure I like from The Economist, but there are many other figures like this, showing that the size of the models have been growing very rapidly over the last few years. And as Emma mentioned earlier, a lot of that is correlated with the accuracy and the capabilities we want. A lot of the discussion has focused on training, the ability to take in large data volumes, incur those training costs, and then produce really capable models. And there, by some estimates, the size of these models has been increasing by a factor of 10 every year or so in recent memory. What we've also observed, however, is that even though there's been a lot of discussion about training cost, inference or serving is the emerging challenge. As more and more of these models are trained, these companies are exploring use cases. And the reason why they're being provided free is that they don't know what those use cases are. They're fishing. They're exploring many different application use cases. And each of these use cases will require queries to the models. And we will eventually need to provide those queries, serve those queries at high throughput. How many queries per second can you support? How many users and parallel queries can you provide? And also latency. How do you respond in a timely fashion? If you do a Google search, you're expecting an answer in the order of 100 milliseconds. If you do a prompt to GPT, you'll get an answer in about 1,000 milliseconds or 1 second, right? So these models are going to be much slower, but also they may need to be optimized for both throughput and latency as we move forward. And as we all know, growth in AI has led to growth in data center capacity. There are lots of figures on this as well. This is a figure I like from McKinsey that shows growth in data center capacity measured in the power that they consume. The y-axis is gigawatts. So we've seen massive growth in hyperscaler data centers, the largest ones run by big tech, shown in the dark blue. We talked about co-located data centers. These are facilities that host machines for other organizations. That's in the light blue. And then you have private data centers. Maybe some of them are here at the university, shown in the gray. But across the board, we're seeing a very large growth in annual growth rates in data center capacity. Of course, I'll note that McKinsey published this paper in January of 2023, so it's sort of unfortunate timing because all of this data predates generative AI. So we would expect these numbers to be as large, if not larger, today, given the recent interest in AI. I'll say as a computer architect, as someone who thinks a lot about hardware and systems, that serving this growth in AI and serving this growth in data center capacity is harder than ever, historically harder than ever. That's because we have historically, over the last few years, relied on adoption of cloud computing to manage the costs of computing. So there was a fairly well-known Science article published in 2020 saying that even as we computed 6.5 times more, we only increased energy uses by 6% from 2010 to 2018. Massive increase in computational load, very little increase relatively in electricity usage. And that is in large part driven by the adoption of cloud computing. We're doing much more cloud computing with Amazon, with Microsoft, with Google, and they know how to manage their data centers very efficiently. And that means that we've shifted from relatively less efficient local data centers to much more efficient hyperscale data centers. And that's played out in the efficiency gains and these numbers that have been discussed in the Science article. However, when you look at this graph, most of the migration into the cloud that has happened has probably already happened. There is still some enterprise scale data centers that are being run. Most of them are being run in hyperscalers and co-location data centers. The second reason why pursuing efficiency is incredibly difficult today compared to where we were decades ago is because Moore's law has ended. The ability to shrink transistors has reached fundamental limits. And even if we can shrink those transistors, it used to be with something called Dennard scaling, you could reduce the operating voltage of those transistors. So even though those transistors got smaller, they also drew less power. That's no longer the case. We can still shrink transistors, but those transistors will draw about the same amount of power as they drew before you shrank them. So smaller transistors no longer give us the energy efficiency that we were expecting, so we can build bigger chips. They will end up drawing more power. And then finally, local grid stress is a concern. Data centers are not distributed uniformly geographically across the United States. There are particular locations in the world, in the United States, where we are building a large number of data centers, and that's having a local impact on the community. One of the most visible examples of this would be Northern Virginia, where Dominion, the utility provider there, is saying that 20% of their load is going to be coming from data centers, and it may hit 50% in the next few years. And this will complicate their efforts to get to meet their sustainability goals in that local setting. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the work we've done in collaboration with Meta, where we were doing some pathfinding on sustainability and how to build sustainable data centers. Much of this was motivated by a study on AI and carbon footprints. And when we talk about carbon, we talk about embodied carbon, the cost of manufacturing semiconductors. And if you're talking about an iPhone or consumer electronics, most of the carbon in that is going to be from semiconductor manufacturing. And that's because your phone really doesn't draw that much power, but it has a lot of silicon in it. And it went through those fabrication processes in Taiwan or in Korea or other places. And that's where we're concerned about embodied carbon. For data centers, we care a lot about operational carbon, as has been already discussed. These numbers are large and getting larger. This is associated with the electricity usage. And this analysis was done with David Brooks at Harvard, and he was showing how the amount of energy used by large data center operators exceeds that consumed by Massachusetts and is approaching that of New England. When we talk about the carbon footprint of AI in particular, we have both the operational and embodied side. So this figure shows recommendation models and language models from a language model from Meta. And about half, more than half of the carbon footprint is associated with running these models. And some non-trivial portion it comes from procuring the hardware needed to deploy and run those models, so the embodied carbon on the bottom. Now, Meta and others will say that they're net zero, and we've already talked a little bit about this, where they are procuring clean energy But those are essentially offsets, and net zero has lots of issues that we can talk about later in the panel. But this is how we think about the carbon footprint of AI. Now, today, about 30% of the costs of the AI pipeline is coming from data pre-processing. A third of the cost is coming from training. A third of the cost is coming from inference. So all three of these computational stages in data centers will be increasingly important to get right. But I'll say that there's a huge uncertainty about the black bar, the carbon footprint associated with inference, simply because we don't know what form inference will take. What are those applications of these AI models? Are you going to be getting these AI-generated responses from Google? Are people going to be using GPT and typing in their prompts? Are we going to have AIs automatically reading our emails and summarizing them for us? All of those use cases will have very different implications for how many queries we send to a trained model. We'll talk a little bit about strategies for improving efficiency. There are a lot of strategies for improving efficiency. And in this study with Meta, we looked at 3 or 4 classes of optimizations. The first would be a hardware-based approach where you design better hardware, improving performance per watt. You could build better chips. You could design custom chips for the AI models you want to run, and that will give you some efficiency gains. You can think about utilization. You can think about computing with lower precision, having less accurate arithmetic inside your chip, and that will reduce energy costs. And then finally, you could imagine resource-efficient models, thinking about the size of your models, the model architecture, the number of parameters you have in your model. And again, that could improve efficiency. And over a period of 2 years, 4 6-month periods, we saw that these optimizations combine and reduce power by about 20% every 6 months. So if you were to compound this and say, well, we reduced power by 20% every 6 months over 4 of these periods, does that mean we've reduced power by 60%? Unfortunately, the answer is no, because as systems become more energy efficient, we may end up using more of it. Emma mentioned rebound effects earlier. I don't know how to quantify those rebound effects. How much of our increased use of AI is coming from the efficiency gains? I think that's a really open question that economists could really help us understand. I'll close by saying some initial directions in data center design for sustainability. This is work, again, in collaboration with Meta, published last year, where we are rethinking how we power data centers. We don't want to use power purchase agreements because they are essentially offsets. They say at the end of the year, if my investments in wind and solar produce this much electricity, my data center consumed this much electricity. If they match, then I am net zero. But that means that there are plenty of hours in the day, plenty of days in the year where you're still drawing energy from the grid, and that has some significant carbon footprint. So net zero doesn't mean 24/7 carbon-free compute. And relying on net zero is challenging because we've seen this really daunting growth in hyperscaler data centers, 25% per year in our analysis. And renewable energy growth in the US, according to the EIA, is only 7% per year. Right? So data centers could consume all of the new renewable energy coming online and then still demand even more. And that's a real challenge we face today. Another challenge we face today, of course, is the issues associated with aligning computation with the availability of that renewable energy. How do you schedule computations so that you compute more when there's lots of renewable energy and compute less otherwise? This requires fundamentally rethinking how data centers compute and how data centers draw energy, and they aren't yet in a position to do that. So we think that the space of solutions here is some combination of continued investment in renewable energy, some investment in fairly large batteries that allow data center to operate on hours of stored carbon-free energy, and some, paradoxically, additional servers, additional hardware that allow you to flex up the compute and compute more in the middle of the day, for example, when there's a lot of solar energy. When we explore this solution space, we've got to think about trade-offs between operational carbon and embodied carbon. We think that there are ways to reduce operational carbon, but we've got to be careful that we're not increasing manufacturing carbon, Scope 3 emissions, when we pursue these solutions. So I'll close by saying that there's a lot more work to be done, and we're assembling a large team funded by the National Science Foundation. The NSF has invested $36 million in performance and energy efficient computing. Penn and Harvard is leading a team that with 12 million of these funds to look at sustainable computing. Emma is actually part of that team. And we're really excited about further exploring the solution space here. The three broad directions we're talking about are accounting. How do we better measure and attribute the embodied and operational carbon of computing? How do we mitigate these, both on the embodied side, the hardware manufacturing side, but also the operational side, the scheduling and the data center electricity use? And of course, finally, we want to have broader impact. We need to engage with academia, with folks in industry, and with policymakers and government to translate many of these tools and techniques into practice. So I think we're really only just getting started, and I'm really excited to be here because it's an opportunity to connect and work together on some of these questions. So with that, I'll close and we can switch to the panel. Not much.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. So we'll start with a reach for optimism. What are some of the current efforts that are being done to make AI more environmentally friendly? The most important ones, in your opinion? This is a question for the whole panel. If I might start with Dr. Strubell. Sorry.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think the most successful current methods, at least one of which Ben mentioned, are methods for model compression, and in particular quantization, which I don't know if you use the word quantization, but referring to, sort of making the individual sort of calculations in the model a little bit less precise, but you don't necessarily need that precision in order to do what you want. So that's, I mean, basically all major tech companies are using that methodology in their, served models, sort of deployed models, and it's definitely reducing the energy costs substantially. So you can, by multiple times, right? You can go from. I'm not gonna describe how quantization works in detail. Sorry, I'm a professor. There was one other thing that I wanted to mention, and now it's sort of skipping my mind. But
we could perhaps move to Dr. Klemmer.
Sure. So this is a great example. Another example I would give is small language models, which is kind of a new trend away from this kind of church of scale. We just figured out that for many tasks, smaller models are sufficient. There are also considerations around the kind of training data you use for training models, right? So it turns out that you actually don't necessarily need all of the data available, like OpenAI uses to throw at a huge neural network. If you have very good data, Microsoft had a quite popular paper on this called textbooks is all you need. So if you train language models on high quality data like textbooks, turns out you actually need much less data, you need less compute. And also sometimes you need smaller models. And so I think that's another very interesting trend. That's specific to language, but I think there's some rules there that can be applied to vision and other modalities as well.
So I guess one thing that I would add also is a move towards sort of more modularized models. So if you've heard of like mixture of experts models, this is basically the sort of type of large model that everyone is sort of moving towards now. And that allows you to sort of effectively have a larger model, but when the model is used during inference time, only a subset of the model is actually being used for a given query, sort of depending on which parts of the model are sort of needed to do that task. And I think this is just the beginning of like a very interesting sort of future path where I'm sort of hopeful that we can do interesting things, which is sort of better aligning the complexity of the task or the sort of capability that we need with the amount of computation that we're using to do that task. So I think this is a hard problem. Sort of like understanding what the complexity of something is going to be before you've done it. But I think that we could make a lot more progress in that direction. But one of the challenges is like the sort of current maybe more naive or sort of existing approaches for that are not super well aligned with the sort of hardware paradigms that we currently use and the ways that we gain efficiency in terms of the hardware. So, yeah.
And I think I'll just jump in and say that everything that was mentioned here is sort of leading towards greater specialization for the models, right? And whether you reduce arithmetic precision because your use case can tolerate it, or whether you can have a mixture of experts and you go to the specialized expert that's best for your task. I think specialization is the path towards much greater energy efficiency. When I was a postdoc at Stanford 10, 15 years ago, we had done a study on specialized hardware. And we looked at a general purpose CPU and a custom chip designed for something. And if you know exactly what you want to accelerate, you can improve energy efficiency by 2 orders of magnitude, 100x, 500x in energy efficiency. But you need to know what that application is so you can build the chip for it. And I think that similarly, there should be an order of magnitude, 2 orders of magnitude in efficiency from specialization, rather than building massive general purpose models with 2 billion parameters and can do everything possible that AI can do right now, right? So I think but I think the difficulty with specialization now is that we don't know what that killer application is. So companies are exploring all these use cases. And once a use case emerges that gets a lot of traction, I could imagine the collective effort of computer science and engineering going in and saying, let's specialize, let's really tailor everything that we can to this particular use case. And that's where those efficiencies could come from.
Maybe I'd like to add a little bit on this. I think another thing we have yet to understand about specialization is that what's currently happening is that we're optimizing both kind of software and hardware components for a very specific type of neural network, which is transformers. And we don't understand if you look at it from an energy efficiency perspective, are we getting stuck in a local minimum? We're all every company is optimizing for the same architecture. There's little exploration happening outside of transformers. And so, there's no answer here, right? This is a completely open question, at least as I understand it.
Yeah, I'll add. I'll add a little bit. So one thing is, if you're interested in sort of that area, there's an article called "The Hardware Lottery" by Sarah Hooker. I think it's very accessible to sort of non-experts in the area that discusses sort of this issue of the sort of hardware software minimum we're in and problems with that. The other thing I would add that I think people enjoy sort of learning who weren't maybe there at the time, the specific model architecture that is prominent that we all use today was designed by Google in order to be efficient on their TPUs and get ROI on the hardware they'd already developed. It worked well for sort of computer vision tasks, but not language tasks. It was not cost effective to run language models on the hardware. So then they developed an algorithm that ran well on that. And now that's where we are. Very much a local minimum, I think.
Thank you all. So let's move on to a more specific question regarding whether there are any corporations or organizations you feel are a good model to follow. Who's doing it right? It's okay to also talk about your own work and organizations in this context.
I think there are startups that are trying to shake things up, and I think that's exciting. I know one of our collaborators on this expedition that we're leading is on the board of Veris, which is a startup. It's funded by Alphabet, it's funded by Sidewalk Infrastructure Partners, which was spun off by Alphabet. But essentially, it's trying to rethink how they design data centers and try to make them more flexible to grid signals. And that's been the holy grail for a very long time, 20, 30 years of research in trying to figure out how data centers can modulate their electricity use based on signals from the grid, whether they be electricity prices or carbon intensity of the energy coming off of the grid. Hyperscale data centers have not done that. They operate at 100% power all the time because that's how you amortize the massive capital cost. You already paid for the power. You already paid for the servers. You should be running them all the time to recover those costs, right? So it's been hard to get the data centers to rethink how they schedule and modulate energy usage. But I think there are startups that are thinking about how to use those signals and be more responsive to the quality of the energy coming off of the grid. So I think the startup space is interesting to watch. And some of these players in the startup space might be also some of the players that had been working Bitcoin mining, which is a different topic. but they're also like thinking a lot about energy markets and computing.
Maybe for the big players, I think the big problem we have is we just don't really know what they're doing, and they're not reporting much, and therefore we can't really say who's doing it right. So thinking about that, I will give some credit to big corporations who are the most committed to transparency and open source, and those are probably Meta, and then also I guess they're at the brink of not being a startup anymore, but Hugging Face, which is they're not really training their own models, but they're like a data and model platform company that is very committed to kind of standardization, reporting standards, and so on. And I think having more open source, having more transparency is kind of the first step that gets us to even being able to evaluate, how much effort are bigger tech companies putting into efficiency, into greening. But yeah, like with the lack of knowledge we have on many of the kind of more closed source player like OpenAI, despite the name. Yeah, I will give credit to open source and transparency and call on everyone to ask for more of that, so we can, make these calls and have these conversations with more detailed information rather than speculating.
Totally agree with Konstantin that no one's doing a fantastic job, but the best of the sort of top companies, the ones that are doing the best job are Meta and Hugging Face, and like the article that Ben was referring to in his presentation that he was a part of that came out of Meta in 2022 is still the sort of the gold. It's like where the gold mine of information that we have access to. And one of my students did an internship at Meta. They're still, I think they're not quite as good, which is a general trend in the industry. As they used to be, but like one of my students, was able to publish a paper based on an internship that provided like very detailed information about, the energy costs and dynamics of large-scale language model training workloads at Meta. So I think that's great. And then I'll also do this sort of selfish thing and add that the Allen Institute for AI, where I also have an affiliation, I think is doing great work to try to develop like fully open source language models and publishing way more details about how they were trained and developed and what data they were trained on. But the problem is they're a nonprofit. Like we can't develop language models at the scale that is happening, scale and breadth that is happening at large companies. So there's still like a gap in terms of that.
Well, I hate to put you guys on the spot with this, but you're not being selfish by raising the Allen Institute. If I might add, you've discussed companies and good examples among companies. Other organizations, NGOs, or governmental bodies that people should be aware of that are relevant in this area that you'd like to raise? So non-companies, basically. If not, we can move on to a question about the companies.
There's an effort, by the National Science Foundation called NAIR, National AI Research Resource. And so the goal there is to, provide the sort of data centers, computational resources, knowledge and infrastructure to enable training and development of these types of like large AI models in academia in the US. Yeah.
Maybe I'll just, for the sake of sparking conversation, and I'll say something that might be a little bit controversial, which is to say that I think the tech companies are not necessarily doing well, but doing something interesting with their investments in nuclear. Because nuclear is carbon-free. And the more we've worked in this space where we've looked at how we could schedule computation in response to time-varying supplies of carbon-free energy, it's just incredibly daunting with wind and solar alone. You can get 95% coverage of your data center compute with renewable energy, and then getting that last 5% with wind and solar requires you to install 5 times as much as you had installed to get that first 95%. Like just this massive diminishing marginal returns, because you're going to want to compute in the middle of the night, and solar is not clearly not a solution there. So getting good carbon-free baseload generation needs to be part of the solution. And nuclear has a long and troubled history in the United States. 3 Mile Island is one thing, but but just the economic override, the economic case for nuclear is daunting, right? Constant, massive budgetary overruns, massive delays in construction timelines. We don't know how to build nuclear effectively. And to the extent that big tech is coming in and putting a lot of money into it, into a very highly risky solution, part of the solution space, I think is a service to the industry. But I understand that a lot of people have different views on nuclear, but I think that's something that might be part of the solution.
And maybe two types of organizations that I would add here is, for one, is like more community-based and educational-focused organizations, and I would include ClimateChangeAI, the organization I'm volunteering for, under that, but there's also more like regional-focused organizations like ClimateAI Africa or so. And these are organizations that kind of try to bridge the machine learning community more with application-focused communities, kind of bring more of this expertise on climate questions into machine learning, educate with programs like summer schools or other curricula. I think that's an important effort that's ongoing, just kind of bring these themes more central into more machine learning organizations. And then the other types of organizations, I think, and we might get to this, so I'm just going to mention it as a teaser now, is standardization bodies. I think we see that both in the US and in the EU recently. I think in the UAI Act, one of the clearest things on this kind of AI and climate intersection was this kind of call for standardization bodies to start drafting documents. And I think they're going to play a huge role in the future.
Thank you. There's actually an audience question that relates to this, where from an audience member who might have missed the news about 3 Mile Island. How soon will AI companies get nuclear power for their data centers actually be used?
Like this 2025.
Nuclear is part of the solution, I think, right now, right? Yeah. I think the question is whether there's going to be new nuclear coming online, and I think that's where the big error bars start appearing, because if you're talking about small modular reactors like Google is talking about, this is an unproven technology, and there isn't a history of building these successfully on schedule and on time and on budget. The Department of Energy says that you need to scale up the workforce, you need to scale up the industry, and the only way you do that is you build more and more of them. So Google is committing to some number of units, right? And that hopefully fills the pipeline, fills the order book, and then helps advance the industry and move it forward. I think retrofitting existing nuclear is a different problem, but also expensive and maybe a little bit less uncertain. But I think nuclear should be part of the discussion.
Thank you. And if I could ask you to elaborate on a point raised during the presentation, because it will address a question here regarding offsets and why they're not a perfect solution. Or to be fair to the question, it asks why they're not a solution at all, not a perfect solution.
Okay, yeah. So there are two types of offsets of varying quality. The first is offsets like you want to go and save the Amazon rainforest, and you go and buy an offset and preserve some number of acres of rainforest. It's incredibly hard to quantify how much of an effect those offsets are actually having. And one of my colleagues at Wharton has some initial data suggesting that you're maybe only getting 20% of the effect that you think you're paying for, right? So that's why offsets in general have a fairly bad name in this space. I think the offsets that the tech companies implement are a little bit better because they are tied to their investments in renewable and renewable energy. So Meta, for example, has invested in wind and solar directly at 55 gigawatts of capacity. And for those investments, every megawatt hour of energy that's being generated by those investments, they get a credit. And then they can apply that credit to the data center energy consumption. And at the end of the year, they hope that the credits will completely cover their data center usage. And as a result, they can say that they're net zero. So it's better than nothing because there are investments in grid. The difficulty is that that accounting happens at the end of the year. So there will be plenty of days when the sun isn't shining or the wind is not blowing, yet they are computing full tilt. And they are relying on that accounting at the end of the year to say net, I am carbon free. I'm net zero. So the question is, can we do better than that and be carbon free on an hourly basis or a daily basis without relying on this accounting on an annual basis? I think the third point that was mentioned earlier is about additionality. These offsets are saying, well, Meta invested in wind or solar that wouldn't have otherwise been installed. Is that really true? Maybe not, because there's much more demand for renewable energy than there is new installations. So I think that's the other concern about offsets.
I would just add that the sort of geographic locality issue as well. Drawing on some of the concerns from the previous panel. It's you can't necessarily build and invest in the renewable energy in the exact same region where the emissions that you're offsetting are happening. And so thinking about the actual impacts on the ground on the local communities, it's very hard to align those things at scale.
So, with regards to the investment in greening AI versus the investment in advancing AI in general, how do you feel they compare to each other, whether in the corporate world or governmental funding for research? Where do you feel that lies?
Sorry, you were saying balancing what?
Basically, the research into making AI greener versus making it better in terms of the overall funding that's going into AI.
Well, I'll speak from my own. I worked with Meta, the Fundamental AI Research Lab, for 2 years as a visiting scientist, where we did some of this work. Most of my colleagues on those teams were pushing 100% for had 100% of their work was spent on sustainability and efficiency. I was there when generative AI and GPT came out in late 2022, and we saw a noticeable shift, all hands on deck for getting Gen AI working for Meta, right, or getting the models going. So I think on the one hand, I'd say that that's natural because it's a tech company and it's computer science, right? So these are computer science researchers, but I think there is a natural division of time and effort between getting Gen AI working and understanding the sustainability of it. I also think that if taking the other side of the position, I think if you are a computer scientist working at these companies, you are seeing a shift in the fundamental technology that we haven't seen since maybe the first .com bubble or burst in the early 2000s when I was starting college. And you're definitely afraid of missing this or losing out. So if your model isn't getting you the accuracy or the capability that you're looking for, you don't want to wonder whether or not if you had thrown another 20 megawatts at the problem, whether you could have gotten that capability or someone else would get that capability first. So I think that's probably where those hard conversations are happening, and whether you want to go for nuclear or whether you want to draw more water than you might otherwise use. So I think there are hard questions, hard discussions being had, even in companies about investments.
I would add that I think that like the environmental positive effects of some development is actually an externality. Like, for example, talking again about small language models, the main motivation for developing small language models is not that they're more energy efficient, but that you can, for example, fit them on a smaller device like a cell phone. I mean, still, the effect is still a good one. But I think the kind of profit-oriented considerations dominate any sustainable environmental considerations by far right now. What I do see, though, is an increasing amount of investment going into not necessarily greening AI, but AI applications for sustainability, which is, I know we have another panel on that, but stuff like AI for material discovery is getting huge amounts of investment. Also using AI for like fusion simulation or so to help us develop fusion reactors. So that's where I really see a lot of promise, not necessary, or an investment, not necessarily the greening itself.
Well, Dr. Klemmer, there's actually an audience question for you. If you could elaborate more on what climate change AI is, because I gave it very short thrift in the intro.
Great question. So ClimateChangeAI is a community-based organization that catalyzes impactful work at the intersection of climate change and AI. And the kind of different pillars are mostly education. So we have a summer school that we run. We're developing a curriculum for people to for computer scientists to learn about climate change, and then for more climate-related people or people from application areas to learn about AI. Then like reports and actually monitoring this intersection, how it's developing, how investments are going, and how these kind of different intersections between AI and climate change are developing. So this is, for example, the paper that Emma had on the slides. And then the community building aspect is a huge one. So we organize workshops like this one at big machine learning conferences. And at New York Climate Week just a month ago, we had an event. And collaborating with big tech companies and parts, like for example, with DeepMind to run projects. So that's what ClimateChangeAI does. You can check it out, climatechange.ai. And we have a newsletter. We have an online community you can join. So please do that.
Thank you, Dr. Klemmer. So not leaving the investment question and without treading on the toes of the next upcoming panel on the business issues, it almost seemed as part of your presentation that this desire to amortize the cost, this run 100% all the time, suggests that not having that, subsidizing more data centers could be a solution. Is that insane?
Say that last part again. Right?
In other words, the desire to keep the data centers running at 100% because of the cost and need to amortize that. It sounded almost as if you were suggesting that investing in more data center capacity is a way to address this issue.
Right. So I think that's an open question. I think that's why I think we need to look holistically at what sustainability folks call Scope 2 and Scope 3 emissions, or the embodied and operational emissions. So if you end up turning off your servers because you don't have carbon-free energy, well, there was a lot of carbon emitted by TSMC when that GPU was built, right? So now you have that carbon cost that was already incurred, and you brought it into your data center, but now you're not really using it to compute. Well, your operational carbon has gone down because you're being really aware of the type of energy you're using when you run your GPU. But if you're not using your GPU at 100%, well, then maybe you shouldn't have. Well, you're not effectively using the carbon that was already emitted by the fab in Taiwan. So I think there's probably going to be a sweet spot where you have to look at the total carbon, both operational and embodied, and figure out how you want to run your data centers. I think the expedition in computing that we're working on with the National Science Foundation is really looking at these trade-offs, because these trade-offs abound. So many things we could do could reduce operational carbon but increase embodied, and vice versa. So how do we think about that? The last example I'll make there would be, if you want to compute more during the middle of the day when there's a huge amount of solar energy. And California has actually this issue where in the middle of the day, lots of solar energy that has to be disconnected from the grid because the grid can't find consumers for that energy. If you want Google to use that energy that no one else is using, solar carbon-free energy, they're going to have to deploy something like 20% more GPUs in their data center that are sitting idle most of the time, and then they're going to be ready to flex off and compute in the middle of the day. When that carbon-free energy becomes available. So you have a much larger hardware cost that's driven by an operational decision. And we got to figure out what the right balance is there.
Thank you. So perhaps this question is more for Dr. Strubell regarding you raised in your presentation earlier today the difference between the energy consumption of training the models versus using them, the inference cost. How much of greening AI's impact is about the AI itself and the infrastructure for it versus people's use of it and better education regarding what they are doing when they use it? Though I'll open the question to all the panelists, of course.
Yeah, I mean, I strongly believe in sort of corporate responsibility rather than consumer responsibility. Primarily, I mean, I think we all need to work together to try to do the best that we can to sort of reduce consumption and just make decisions and do things that are going to be better for the environment. But I strongly believe that it's the responsibility of governments and corporations primarily to drive that change and set up the systems and processes so that we don't have to worry about it to the extent possible. Yeah, I mean, I could rant about that for longer, but yeah.
Yeah, I guess I would add that just as electricity might be underpriced, given the negative externalities of generating it, and water is underpriced, I think AI is currently heavily underpriced, which is what we were talking about earlier. Your $20 a month subscription for premium services on GPT-3 or whatever, or GPT-4, doesn't cover the cost of training the model or even running it, right? So as an earlier speaker said, they are losing a lot of money providing and embedding AI in all of these services, Office 365 or Google's search engine or whatever. And that's because they don't know where the use case is. So they are exploring. And this exploration is incredibly expensive. So the costs of AI are not yet priced in. These are costs that they are incurring in the hope of generating those revenues or profits later.
And one more thing that I think is underpriced is just the pressure that more and more AI-related energy use puts on the grid. I think we haven't really touched on this, but you can't just add, like even if we were able to add a lot of more green energy sources, we couldn't necessarily process in the US grid, especially is breaking apart in many parts. And this is not something that tech companies can fix. Sure, they can build like a little nuclear reactor right next to the data center and have like be off the grid, like have their own one. But for most applications, that's not going to be the case. And so specifically for the US, like there's huge infrastructure investments needed for the grid specifically that are bottlenecking a lot of stuff. And so that is also not priced into the current kind of everyone generating all the time.
Thank you. We've heard the term underpriced a lot throughout these both these panels, but there's also the word responsibility and consumer versus corporate. An audience question asks about the responsibility basically of participants in this who aren't the corporation per se, but like the programmers, the builders of the tech. It refers to the joint venture Silicon Valley identifying that 50% of tech employees wanted their employers to prioritize sustainability goals and do less harm. How important do you feel that is in terms of both how important and how effective do you feel that is in moving the needle on this anyway? I realize it's a tough one, and it's okay to say we don't know.
I'll build on something that Emma mentioned earlier, which is to say, I think individual responsibility is good, but probably not the scalable solution here, because, for example, there's something called the Green Software Foundation that provides APIs, programming interfaces, and tries to tell software developers, oh, maybe we'll connect you with carbon telemetry about the electricity your program is using. And then your program might be able to adapt in some way to use less energy. Maybe it'll compute less intensely based on that telemetry, right? So it's sort of exposing individual software developers to the energy sources and the carbon intensity. I personally think that as a computer scientist, that's probably the wrong way to do it, because it's breaking what computer scientists hold dear to their heart, which are abstraction layers. You shouldn't have to worry about what's happening on the grid when you're programming your individual function for some piece of software, right? So I think going to the responsibility, I think the responsibility should be done at the hyperscale big tech companies, because Google, for example, if they're running a 100 megawatt data center, they can decide, oh, we're not going to draw the full 100 megawatts, we're going to go down to 95. And then internally, their job scheduling processes and their resource allocation processes will figure out, how that 5 megawatt cut gets distributed across all of their machines and all of their users and so on. So in some sense, they're running their own microgrid at that scale, and they can achieve much larger effects, I think, if they were to come up with right policies and solutions.
I mean, the best thing would be, I mean, for employees of big tech or so to put their voices forward would be some sort of labor organization, but that's non-existent in tech pretty much. So in the absence of that, I think doing community work is something that people can do and are doing, and I mean, big part of the volunteering pool of ClimateChangeAI is actually working in tech and in many other organizations. So that is happening. People can put their time into this. People can contribute to kind of open source projects and kind of increase transparency in what tech is doing and kind of the models that are being developed. I think that is a good use of people's time. But again, I also want to echo a bit what Emma said, like individual responsibility also as someone who has to make a living, especially in a very expensive area like here. I think there's some of it as privileged people working in tech with high salaries and good degrees, but I wouldn't ascribe too much responsibility to people because it's hard.
Thank you. If I may, before we close out with a much more hopeful question, there's one other audience question about the 20% power reduction goal that was mentioned earlier. And this is for the whole panel. What would you consider a useful and effective goal in terms of AI systems becoming sustainable? What is your vision of that? What empirical or qualitative measure would you associate with? We did it. We got there.
Yeah.
How good is good enough is another way, perhaps, to think of this.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Yeah. I'd like to see much more rigorous cost-benefit thinking when you think about AI systems, and like lifetime cost-benefit. And the first step for that, again, is to actually gather data on costs. And then, like, it's usually people are better on capturing, potential benefits and quantifying them rather than costs. But so some rigorous reporting standards that really help us capture these lifetime costs and in all of the different stages, like direct training costs, embodied costs, and then the kind of even like rough estimates for system costs will be good. If we get that, we can get much better at doing these cost-benefit analyses, and then that will really help us make decisions as a whole society of what systems are kind of worth developing and what systems are maybe less worth developing, or we can base policy on that. That's what I would love to see.
It's wonderful. Thank you. So for the whole panel, a follow-up on that, if I may. Do you feel that once costs are better understood by more people, once we can attach fair prices to what we truly value, is that what we should be striving for overall? Would you agree that that is a consistent good to try to achieve for the common good?
I think there are. I think in this moment where there's a lot of uncertainty about the technology and the scaling trends, we have seen daunting scaling trends. I think there's a lot of uncertainty about inference and use cases, and how we will end up using AI on a daily basis in ways that we work and live and play. So I think it's not clear to me what the baseline is, which is why I had difficulty answering your question earlier, which is like, is 45% enough? I don't know if we've been increasing by 10x a year and we continue to do that, 45% reduction is not going to be enough. But I think there's a lot of uncertainty because there's a lot of speculative investment in infrastructure right now, in my view, where there is an assumption that there will be this demand for inference and it will indeed change the way we live and work. And we need the GPUs necessary to serve all of those queries, right? And I think until we figure out where the steady state is, until we figure out what these models will be used for by the vast majority of people, not just people in the know, then we know where the baseline is and we can optimize from there. But I also think that this ad-based model for generating revenue can probably not sustain the cost of generative AI. So we will probably need to have people paying much more for these services than we do today. $20 a month is not going to cut it for accessing these most advanced models. I'm pretty sure about that.
I'll give like a sort of high level answer to the general question of like sort of what does success look like to me. So I think one of the sort of high level motivating aspects for why I sort of work on this and care about this is I'm just like so frustrated to see the technology that I work on, the field that I'm a part of, just like sort of contributing to like further separation between haves and have-nots, or like basically increasing sort of like social inequities and emphasizing social inequities. So to me, and so obviously sort of climate impacts are an important part of that. So to me, the future that I want to see is we can have AI and it's doing fantastic things and it's actually sort of reducing those gaps and social inequities rather than increasing them, whatever that looks like.
That's absolutely wonderful. Thank you. Thank you all. So, given what is clear, the clear difficulties in predicting the future and insufficient information, I'm going to ask you all the very easy question of what do you see as the most significant and most promising trends in this area looking forward, which is very hard to do.
So the most promising and significant trends in what's just reducing...
In greening AI.
Greening AI, okay.
Yes. And any particular developments you feel the audience should keep their eye on. And while you think about that, just a word to the audience. A couple of you, I did not get to your questions because I do need to give a shout out to the upcoming panels on AI's impact and sustainability and the business focus panels as well, where I'm hoping those questions will actually be addressed.
I can give a cop-out answer and then you guys will look better. I sort of want to echo some of the points that Konstantin was making earlier, probably both of you were making earlier. Like, I feel like I can't answer that question because we do not have the data. I think there's like an aspect of like fundamental ambiguity because of like the pace of developments in the field, and we sort of like don't know. It's research and development, it's, like actively changing. But also we just like don't know what the sort of use cases are. We don't know what the successful use cases are going to be. We don't know what the current popular use cases are. And so it's really just, I have a great understanding of like all these different sort of possible pathways to sort of emphasize and allocate funding, but without like better information and data, I don't know what the most promising path forward is.
I guess I think what I find projecting out into the future, what I would expect to see is that data centers will continue to integrate much more closely compute with energy systems. So this will probably, they've already been investing a lot in wind and solar. If I had said this 3 weeks ago, I would have been a prophet, a clairvoyant, because the nuclear, right, it just came in 2 weeks ago, right? And now the question is, if data centers now have these massive 100 megawatt compute assets, they have massive generation capacity, they also have potentially massive energy storage, then there will be an opportunity for a new business model in which they will coordinate the decision making across all of these physical assets, and they will determine when they will want to compute, when they want to store energy in whatever form they're storing energy in, and how they want to sell their energy onto the broader grid. Something like that, where the business model is not just compute, but also maybe energy, engaging in the energy markets in a more fundamental way. So I'm sort of curious what folks in the business and policy side will think about some of these questions, because it seems like we're seeing that trend, and that's likely to continue.
Maybe this is the pathway towards better regulation of tech companies.
Because energy markets are regulated.
Yeah, no, exactly. Now they're energy companies, and that's our way in.
I have three things that make me hopeful. First one is like events like this, and just seeing more and more people caring about this space and investing more of their time and whole careers into this. including lots of students. So many students. Like the ClimateChangeAI summer school had, I think, around 8,000 people who signed up, which is crazy, especially considering that it was actually not free. Like there were stipends for people who are from low-income backgrounds, but still, it was incredible. So the community makes me hopeful. That's one thing. On the policy side, I think we see some policy resonance both in the US and the EU, especially towards reporting standards, impact assessments. Not even like hard regulation, right? This is just transparency and assessments, which is great to see. That makes me hopeful. And the last thing on the method side is what I mentioned earlier about this kind of data focus and that data engineering, data-centric machine learning, I think we're just getting started on that. And we see potentially incredible kind of efficiency gains with especially purpose-built models, again, smaller models that can be really good. And maybe we'll see a bit more of a trend towards that in the future, which would also be nice. So these are 3 hopeful things.
Thank you for that hopeful note. And since we are just over time, I'm going to close out by doing 2 very quick things. One is to say that Dr. Strubell's answer was not a cop-out answer. So many ills are born of ignorance, and we always can use more data. As Dr. Klemmer mentioned, I think we all owe a debt of thanks to Irina Raiku and the wonderful people at the Markkula Center for arranging this event. And so I'd like to close out and let everyone go to lunch with an invitation to thank our wonderful panelists for today.
So really quickly, for those of you online, please join us again in an hour. Those of you in the room, lunch will be served right outside. If you'll allow me, I just wanted to say one thing, because we were talking about corporate versus individual responsibility, and we've been talking about hyperscalers. In terms of the hyperscale of the users, Hugging Face, which was mentioned, just announced that they have 1 million models on their platform. Those are AI models on the platform. And OpenAI announced that there are 200 active weekly users of ChatGPT, 200 million active weekly users of ChatGPT. And that's just one big model. So if you add to the 200 million, the hundreds of millions that are using Meta, Amazon, Microsoft, and other models, that's the hyperscale. That's all of us playing with those tools right now. So I think it's okay to also ask yourself as a consumer, do you need to turn your report into a podcast? Because that's the newest feature that just got released. And if you don't, and if you understand the environmental cost, maybe you can make different choices about your own usage.